Do mirrors only reflect what you see, or do they trap time itself, your past, your future, and a destiny you were never meant to know? Your eyes lock onto the mirror, but the eyes inside never let you go. You think you're watching, but in truth, you're being watched. "Hello, Sarah," it said, smiling that horrible smile. "I've been waiting. What do you want from me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I told you, I want your life, but I'm patient. I can wait. Why me? Why not you? You looked into the mirror. You saw me. That was all the invitation I needed. Margaret Wells saw you too, didn't she?" My reflection's smile widened. Margaret was weak. She fought too hard too fast, burned herself out. You're smarter, stronger. You'll last longer. What happened to her? She's here with me now. Would you like to see her? The reflection stood up and walked to the side of the mirror. When it returned, it wasn't alone. Behind it, barely visible in the strange light of the mirror world, was another figure. A woman in her 30s, wearing clothes from the 1960s. Margaret Wells. She looked terrified and exhausted, but she was trying to communicate something. She was pointing at something behind my reflection, mouthing words I couldn't understand. "She's been trying to warn people," my reflection said casually. "Previous tenants who were smart enough to cover the mirror before I could make contact. But you can see how effective that's been. How many others? Oh, dozens over the years. This building has such a high turnover rate. People move in, start seeing things, get scared, and leave. But some of them, like you and Margaret, are curious enough to investigate. Those are the ones I can work with." I stared at Margaret's ghostly figure. She was still trying to tell me something, becoming more agitated. What is she trying to say? Who knows? The dead don't make much sense. But don't worry about her. Worry about yourself. Because I'm getting stronger, Sarah, every day. Every time you look in a mirror, any mirror, I learn more about how to be you. That's when I realized the true horror of my situation. It wasn't just this mirror. Every time I had looked in a bathroom mirror, a car mirror, any reflective surface over the past few months, this thing had been watching me, learning from me, copying me. You've been in every mirror. I am every mirror now. Every reflection you see. I've been practicing being you, and I'm getting very good at it. To prove its point, my reflection began moving exactly as I moved, speaking exactly as I spoke, even before I did it. It was like it was predicting my actions rather than copying them. Soon, I'll be ready to make the switch, it said with my voice, using my mannerisms, my facial expressions. You'll step through to my side, and I'll step through to yours. Don't worry, it only hurts for a moment. I won't let you. You don't have a choice. Every time you look in a mirror, I get stronger and you get weaker. Haven't you noticed? The weight loss, the exhaustion, the shaking hands. That's not stress, Sarah. That's me, taking little pieces of you every time we make contact. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking. I had been attributing it to caffeine and anxiety. But what if? How long do I have? Not long now. A few more days, maybe a week. Then you'll be too weak to resist. and I'll be strong enough to cross over. Margaret was becoming more frantic in her gestures. She was pointing not at my reflection, but at something else. Something on the mirror itself. I looked closer. Along the edge of the mirror, barely visible in the ornate carving of the frame, were symbols. They looked like letters, but in no alphabet I recognized. What are those symbols? My reflection glanced back casually. Oh, those binding marks. They keep the mirror connected to your world. Margaret carved them herself. Back in 1963, she thought she was protecting herself, but she actually made it easier for me to cross over. Margaret shook her head violently and pointed more insistently at the symbols. She's trying to tell you something, my reflection said with amusement. But whatever it is, it's too late. The binding is too strong now. But I was studying Margaret's gestures more carefully. She wasn't just pointing at the symbols. She was making a motion with her hands, like she was scratching or carving something. She wants me to change the symbols, I said. Even if you could figure out what to change them to, it wouldn't matter. The binding has had 60 years to grow strong. You're trapped, Sarah. We both are. The only difference is that I'm going to be free soon, and you never will be. Asterisk, but Margaret had heard me. She nodded enthusiastically and began making more elaborate gestures. She held up fingers, numbers. Then she mimed writing or carving motions. She's trying to tell me which symbols to change, I said. It won't work, my reflection said. But for the first time, it looked concerned. Margaret held up 3 fingers, then pointed to a symbol that looked like a sideways figure 8. Then she made a cutting motion across it. I understood. Change the 3rd symbol by cutting through it. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a knife. My reflection screamed, with a sound like breaking glass. Don't you dare. You'll ruin everything. I pressed the knife to the carved symbol Margaret had indicated. The moment the metal touched the wood, my reflection doubled over as if in pain. Stop, it shrieked. You don't understand. If you break the binding, you'll destroy us both. But Margaret was nodding encouragingly, making more gestures. Cut the 3rd symbol, then the 7th, then the 12th. I carved through the 3rd symbol, and my reflection fell to its knees. The mirror world behind it began to flicker and waver. Please, my reflection begged, and it sounded exactly like me in genuine distress. We can work together. I can give you power, knowledge, anything you want. Don't destroy us both. But I could see Margaret in the mirror world, and she looked more solid now, more real. She was smiling and nodding, urging me to continue. I cut through the 7th symbol. The mirror began to crack. Not visible cracks, but I could hear the sound of fracturing glass. My reflection was screaming continuously now, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. You're killing me, it screamed. I'm part of you now. If I die, you die. I hesitated. What if it was telling the truth? What if these entities became so connected to their hosts that destroying one meant destroying both? But Margaret shook her head and mouthed the word lies. She pointed to herself, still existing, still aware, even though her reflection entity was presumably destroyed when she died. I cut through the 12th symbol. The mirror exploded, not literally, The glass remained intact, but there was a sensation of explosion, of something being torn apart and scattered. The mirror world collapsed into darkness, and my reflection disappeared with a final, echoing scream. Margaret's figure remained for a moment longer. She smiled at me, mouthed the words "thank you," and faded away peacefully. The mirror was just a mirror again. When I looked into it, I saw only myself, exhausted, shaking, traumatized, but alone in my reflection. I covered the mirror again and left it covered. That was 3 days ago. I'm recording this because I need to document what happened, but also because I need to warn others. The apartment building is still there. Apartment 4B is probably going to be available for rent soon, because I'm moving out as soon as I can find somewhere else to go. If you're ever looking for a cheap apartment, and someone shows you a place with a large antique mirror that comes with the lease, and is too heavy to move, don't take it. No matter how perfect the apartment seems otherwise, no matter how desperate you are, because some things are worse than being homeless. Some things are worse than being broke. Some things are worse than living in your car. Being trapped in a mirror world, watching someone else live your life, is worse than all of those things. I broke the binding in my apartment, but there might be other mirrors, other entities, other people going through what I went through. If you're experiencing strange things with mirrors, if your reflection seems off, if you catch glimpses of movement that doesn't match your own, if you hear sounds coming from behind the glass, don't ignore it. Don't assume it's stress or hallucinations. Asterisk cover every mirror in your home. Leave if you can, and if you can't leave, look for the symbols. They might be carved into the frame, or etched into the glass itself, or hidden somewhere on the mirror's surface. Find them and destroy them before the entity gets strong enough to cross over, because once it does, you'll never get your life back. Asterisk I'm staying in a hotel tonight. Tomorrow I'm going to find a new apartment, and I'm going to make sure it doesn't have any mirrors at all. No bathroom mirrors, no decorative mirrors, no mirrored closet doors, nothing. I'm going to live the rest of my life without ever looking at my own reflection again, because I never want to risk seeing someone else looking back. I spun back around, heart racing, but everything looked normal. My reflection was facing the same direction I was, looking concerned and confused, just as I must have looked. I stood there for several minutes, staring at myself, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. I went to bed, leaving the sheet off the mirror. That was my first mistake. The next few days were relatively normal. I went to work, came home, lived my life. I made a point of walking past the mirror frequently, checking my reflection, proving to myself that everything was fine. And it was fine, mostly except for the small things. The way my reflection seemed to watch me a moment too long before looking away. The way it sometimes seemed to be breathing at a slightly different rhythm than I was. The way it occasionally appeared to be listening to something I couldn't hear. I started talking to Dr. Martinez about it again. She was concerned about my fixation on the mirror and suggested that maybe I should move apartments. But I couldn't afford to break my lease, and the idea of losing my security deposit was terrifying. She increased my medication dosage and scheduled more frequent appointments, but the medication wasn't helping anymore, because the things that were happening were getting harder to dismiss as hallucinations. I would come home from work to find small things moved around the apartment, a book left open to a different page, a coffee cup moved from the kitchen counter to the living room table, the TV on a different channel than I remembered. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful. Stress can cause memory problems. But I started paying closer attention, even leaving small tests for myself. I'd place a pen in a specific location before leaving for work and find it somewhere else. When I returned, the changes were always small. A pen moved 3 inches to the left. A magazine closed when I had left it open. A piece of mail moved from one pile to another. Someone was in my apartment when I was gone. I changed the locks. I installed a deadbolt. I bought a security camera and set it up pointing at the front door. But the camera never showed anyone entering or leaving except me. That's when I realized the changes were happening while I was home. I would go to the kitchen to make dinner, and when I returned to the living room, something would be different. Not dramatically different, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. And I was paying attention to everything now. I started staying awake as much as possible, fighting off sleep with caffeine and sheer willpower. I wanted to catch whatever was happening in the act. I wanted proof that I wasn't losing my mind. It was during one of these vigils, around 3 a.m. on a Tuesday night, that I saw her clearly for the first time. I was sitting on the couch, facing the mirror, when I noticed my reflection was looking slightly to the left while I was looking straight ahead. Not dramatically, just a few degrees off. Enough to notice. I stared at my reflection, and it stared back. I tilted my head. It tilted its head. But there was still that sense of disconnection, like watching a video call with a slight delay. Then my reflection smiled. I wasn't smiling. The reflection's smile was wide and cold, nothing like any expression I would make. It looked like someone imitating a smile without understanding what a smile was supposed to convey. And it held that expression while I sat there, mouth open in shock, definitely not smiling. I stood up quickly, and my reflection stood up too. But it stood up smoothly, gracefully, while I had stumbled to my feet in surprise. It was like watching someone else wearing my face. I walked closer to the mirror, and my reflection walked closer too. We were face to face now, separated only by the glass. And I could see that while we looked identical, we weren't the same. My reflection's eyes were too bright, its skin too pale, its movements too fluid. "Who are you?" I whispered. My reflection's mouth moved, but no sound came out. It pointed to itself, then to me, then back to itself. It was trying to communicate something. I reached out to touch the glass, and my reflection reached out too. Our palms should have met on opposite sides of the mirror, but as my hand got closer to the glass, I could swear I felt warmth, not the coolness of glass, but the warmth of another person's skin. I jerked my hand back, and my reflection jerked back too. But again, the timing was wrong. It moved a split second after I did, like it was copying me rather than mirroring me. "What do you want?" I asked. This time, my reflection's mouth moved in perfect sync with words I could hear, but the voice wasn't coming from me. I want to live. The voice was exactly like mine, but it was coming from the mirror. I wasn't speaking. I was barely breathing, but I could hear my own voice, clear as day, coming from the glass. I want your life. My reflection continued. I want your body. I want your world. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table. This wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't stress or sleep deprivation. There was something in the mirror, something that looked like me and sounded like me, but definitely wasn't me. You're not real, I said. My voice shaking. My reflection smiled, that horrible, too wide smile. Neither are you, it replied. Not anymore. I ran to the bedroom and slammed the door. I called Dr. Martinez's emergency line, but when I tried to explain what had happened, the words sounded insane even to me. She scheduled an emergency appointment for the next morning and strongly recommended that I go to the hospital if I felt unsafe. I didn't go to the hospital. I was afraid they would lock me up. Instead, I researched. I spent the entire night online, searching for any information about mirrors, reflections, supernatural phenomena. Most of what I found was nonsense, but there were a few sources that seemed credible. Mirror spirits, doppelgangers, reflection entities. Different cultures had different names for them, but the concept was surprisingly universal. Beings that existed in mirrors, feeding off the life force of those who looked into them, growing stronger with each interaction, learning to mimic their targets more and more accurately. According to the folklore, these entities could eventually take over completely, replace their targets, step through the mirror into the real world while trapping their victim on the other side. It sounded ridiculous, but after what I had experienced, ridiculous was starting to seem possible. Some sources mentioned ways to protect yourself, salt lines around mirrors, iron filings, specific prayers or incantations. But the most common advice was simple. Avoid the mirror entirely. Cover it, remove it, or leave. I couldn't remove the mirror. It was built into the wall. I couldn't afford to leave, but I could cover it. I went to the hardware store and bought the heaviest tarp I could find, along with industrial strength tape. I covered every inch of the mirror, sealing the edges completely. Then I rearranged my furniture so that the couch faced away from it. For a week, everything was quiet. I started to hope that maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just stress, and covering the mirror was a psychological placebo that allowed me to feel safe. But on the 8th night, I woke up to the sound of tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from behind me, from the direction of the covered mirror. A slow, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on glass from the inside. I lay in bed, frozen with terror, listening to the sound. It went on for hours. Sometimes it would stop for a few minutes, and I would start to relax, thinking it was over. Then it would start again. By morning, the tapping had stopped. But when I went to check the mirror, I found that some of the tape had been pulled loose, not removed completely, but loosened, as if someone had been trying to lift the tarp from underneath. I retaped it, using twice as much tape as before. The next night, the tapping was louder, more insistent, and it wasn't just tapping anymore. I could hear scratching sounds like fingernails on glass, and underneath it all, very faintly, I could hear my own voice calling my name. Sarah, Sarah, let me out. Sarah. I put pillows over my head and tried to ignore it, but the sound seemed to penetrate everything. It went on until dawn. This continued for weeks. Every night, the sounds would start, tapping, scratching, calling my name. During the day, I would find the tape loosened or torn. I would repair it, and the cycle would begin again. I stopped sleeping. I lived on caffeine and adrenaline, afraid to close my eyes because I could feel something watching me. Even through the covered mirror, I lost weight. My hands shook constantly. My co-workers started asking if I was okay. Dr. Martinez was deeply concerned. She wanted to hospitalize me for my own safety, but I convinced her to let me try a different approach. I told her I was going to stay with friends for a while, get away from the apartment and the stress. I lied. Instead, I decided to confront whatever was in the mirror. I had been doing more research, and I found references to something called mirror binding. The idea was that if you could communicate with the entity in the mirror, you might be able to negotiate with it or find a way to send it away. It was dangerous. Several sources warned that direct communication could make the entity stronger, but I was desperate. I couldn't live like this anymore. I waited until midnight, then carefully removed the tarp. My reflection was waiting for me, but it wasn't trying to mimic me anymore. It was sitting in a chair that didn't exist in my living room, in what looked like a perfect copy of my apartment, but subtly wrong. The colors were too saturated. The shadows fell in the wrong directions, and my reflection looked healthier than I did. Less tired, less frightened. My name is Sarah, and I need to tell someone what happened to me. What's still happening to me? Maybe if I say it out loud, record it, share it with the world, it will finally stop. Or maybe it will make things worse. I don't know anymore. I can't trust my own mind. It started 3 months ago when I moved into an apartment for beyond Elm Street. The rent was suspiciously cheap for downtown, but I was desperate, fresh out of college, drowning in student loans, working to part-time jobs just to afford ramen noodles. When Mrs. Chen showed me the apartment, I should have asked why it was so affordable. I should have wondered why she avoided eye contact when she handed me the keys. The apartment was small but clean. Hardwood floors, decent kitchen, one bedroom with a large window facing the courtyard. Everything seemed perfect except for one thing. In the living room, mounted on the wall opposite the couch, was an enormous antique mirror. The frame was ornate, carved from what looked like black walnut, with intricate designs that seemed to shift and move in my peripheral vision. The mirror itself was old, with that slight waviness you see in antique glass. Mrs. Chen noticed me staring at it. "It comes with the apartment," she said quickly. "Previous tenant left it. Too heavy to move. You don't mind, do you?" I should have minded. God, I should have minded. But I was 22 and broke, and the apartment was perfect otherwise. So I signed the lease, moved in my pathetic collection of second-hand furniture, and tried to ignore the mirror as much as possible. For the first few weeks, everything was normal. I got into a routine. Wake up at 6, shower, grab coffee, work at the bookstore until 3. Then head to my evening shift at the diner, come home exhausted, eat whatever was cheapest, watch Netflix on my laptop, and fall asleep on the couch because the bedroom felt too isolated. I always sat with my back to the mirror. It wasn't a conscious decision at first. The couch just happened to face the TV, which was positioned so that the mirror was behind me. But as days passed, I realized I was actively avoiding looking at it. There was something about it that made me uncomfortable. Not scared, exactly, just unsettled. The first strange thing I noticed was in the morning. I'd wake up on the couch, and for just a moment before I was fully awake, I'd catch a glimpse of the mirror in my peripheral vision, and I could swear I saw someone standing in front of it. But when I turned to look, it was just my own reflection, disheveled and confused from sleep. I told myself it was just the grogginess, that twilight state between sleeping and waking where your brain plays tricks on you. Everyone experiences that, right? But it kept happening. And then I started noticing other things. When I walked past the mirror to go to the kitchen, sometimes I'd feel like someone was walking behind me. I'd catch a glimpse of movement that didn't match my own. When I'd stop suddenly, the movement would stop too, but just a fraction of a second too late. I started paying closer attention to my reflection. At first, everything seemed normal. I'd wave, it would wave. I'd smile, it would smile. I'd make faces, it would make the same faces. But gradually, I began to notice tiny discrepancies. The timing was off by milliseconds. When I blinked, my reflection blinked just a moment after I did. When I tilted my head, the reflection tilted its head in the right direction. But the movement seemed sluggish, like it was copying me rather than mirroring me naturally. I started testing it deliberately. I'd stand in front of the mirror and make sudden movements. Quick gestures, unexpected poses. Most of the time, the reflection kept up perfectly, but occasionally, just occasionally, there would be that tiny delay. That split second where I moved and my reflection hadn't quite caught up. I began to think I was losing my mind. The stress of working 2 jobs, living alone for the first time, the financial pressure, it was all getting to me. I made an appointment with a therapist through the community health center. Dr. Martinez was kind and patient, and when I told her about the mirror, she nodded understandingly. Visual hallucinations can be a symptom of extreme stress and sleep deprivation, she explained. When did you last get a full 8 hours of sleep? I couldn't remember. She prescribed mild sleeping pills and suggested I establish a better sleep routine. Cover the mirror with a sheet if it bothered me. Get blackout curtains for the bedroom. Create a space where I felt safe and comfortable. I followed her advice. I bought a cheap bedsheet and draped it over the mirror. I moved my few belongings into the bedroom and started sleeping in an actual bed for the first time. Since moving in, for a while, it worked. The sleeping pills knocked me out, and I'd wake up in the bedroom feeling more rested than I had in weeks. The weird feelings about the mirror faded. I even started to laugh about it. Stress hallucinations. How ridiculous. I was fine. Everything was fine. But the mirror wasn't gone. It was just covered dot, and somehow that made it worse. I could feel it there behind the sheet. This massive presence in my living room, waiting. Sometimes when I'd come home from work, the sheet would be slightly askew, as if someone had been looking behind it. I'd straighten it and tell myself it must have been the air conditioning or a breeze from an open window, but I never left the windows open. 3 weeks after covering the mirror, I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. It was around 2 a.m., and the apartment was dark except for the streetlight filtering through the bedroom window. I stumbled through the living room, half asleep, and stopped dead in my tracks. The sheet had fallen. The mirror was completely uncovered, reflecting the dim light from the street. And standing in front of it, with her back to me, was a figure. My heart stopped. Someone had broken into my apartment. Someone was in my living room, standing in front of my mirror in the middle of the night. I was about to scream when the figure turned around. It was me. But it wasn't me. The reflection, because that's what it had to be. Even though I was standing across the room, looked exactly like me, but wrong. The eyes were too wide, the smile too broad, and it was staring directly at me. Even though reflections don't work that way, if I was standing near the bedroom doorway, my reflection should be showing me from that angle, not facing me head-on like a person would. I blinked hard, shook my head, convinced I was dreaming or hallucinating. When I opened my eyes, everything was normal. The sheet was still on the mirror. The room was empty. I was alone. I went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and went back to bed. But I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I called in sick to both jobs and spent the day researching the apartment building. I went to the library and searched through old newspaper archives, city records, anything I could find about 1247 Elm Street. What I found made my blood run cold. The building was built in 1923, and for the first 40 years, nothing unusual was reported. But in 1963, a young woman named Margaret Wells was found dead in apartment for B. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, but the circumstances were strange. She was found sitting in front of a large mirror, and according to the police report, she had been talking to someone when neighbors heard her through the thin walls. But when they broke down the door after she stopped responding to knocks, she was alone. The mirror found in her apartment matched the description of the one in my living room exactly. Ornate black walnut frame, antique glass, too heavy to move easily. Margaret Wells had been living in the apartment for 6 months before her death. According to neighbors, she had become increasingly isolated and paranoid in the weeks leading up to her death. She claimed someone was watching her, following her, copying her movements. She claimed her reflection was acting independently. The newspaper article mentioned that Margaret had been found with a journal. Most of the entries were normal, but the final entries described increasingly disturbing encounters with what she called the other. Me. She wrote about her reflection moving at different times than she did. She wrote about conversations she would have with the figure in the mirror. She wrote about how the figure was trying to take her place. The last entry, dated the day she died, was a single sentence: "She's trying to come through. I won't let her." I photocopied everything and went home with shaking hands. That night, I couldn't bring myself to go to sleep. I sat on my couch, back to the covered mirror, and tried to process what I had learned. A woman had died in my apartment. A woman who experienced the exact same things I was experiencing. But that was impossible. Mirrors don't work that way. Reflections are just light bouncing off glass. There's no consciousness there, no independent entity. I was letting the power of suggestion and my own stress create a narrative that didn't exist. I decided to prove it to myself. I walked over to the mirror and yanked off the sheet. My reflection stared back at me, normal and expected. I waved, it waved. I smiled, it smiled. I made faces, jumped up and down, spun in circles. Everything was perfectly synchronized. I felt ridiculous. I had worked myself into a panic over nothing. Margaret Wells was clearly mentally ill, and I had let her story get into my head. I was going to remove the sheet permanently and stop letting an inanimate object control my life. But as I turned to walk away, I caught something in my peripheral vision. My reflection didn't turn with me.